Imagine almost 500,000 innocent men, women and children condemned to live in the middle of the desert. Imagine the place where they live. Sand and dry bushes dominate the landscape. There is no sea and no mountains. Riverbeds are mostly dry and the sky rarely produces rain. This place is called Dadaab, the largest refugee camp on earth.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Dadaab.
Hey, I go.
My impressions are more or less the same ones as when I was here in 2007. Camps are obviously overcrowded, this time yet even more overcrowded, and there's a lack of services throughout because of the huge population. All the refugees have a hard time just surviving, continuing their lives.
People, refugees, escaped the war and insecurity, famine and hopelessness. They left their homeland because they were scared, because they couldn't bear putting lives of their children at risk.
When we are Somalia, we were not going we were not going outside from the house.
There was one time when we were in our house, then they started some shooting guns, and some people were just screaming.
Or just like watching on the mirror, watching people running away, killing each other.
Where they came from, life has been unbearable, unrelenting, dangerous and cheap. Fighting and famine brought once proud Somalia to its knees. Many people lost their loved ones back in Somalia or in other country where they came from. Families crossed the border to Kenya, some illegally, braving danger, extortion and violence. Some died on the way to the camp, others lost everything. Those who arrived were often sick, dehydrated, starving. But at least they made it. They thought, now our children would be able to live in peace, to obtain knowledge, to have a chance in life. But the reality is brutally unlike the dream. Dadaab is now synonymous to indefinite waiting, to misery and frustration, to shattered dreams. Once refugees arrive here, they get registered, fed and housed in simple dwellings and tents. Then they are told to wait. Some are already waiting for 2 decades.
My first impression was
it was huge. It was an enormous place, and even the question came up to me is that how one really managed this place because of this influx of refugees coming on a daily basis, as well as those who are already there. Another thing also is diversity, because although majority are refugees from Somalia, but also you find smaller percentage of other refugees from other parts of Africa, like Rwanda, Uganda.
What we saw was quite shocking, although what we had been hearing was shocking enough. And from the point of view of education as a human right, you can see right away that apart from the fact that they are not receiving enough basic services, either from the point of view of shelter and food and nutrition and others, you can see right away that their livelihood and the right to education is not necessarily being respected. And this is the part of the population around the world, refugees around the world, who tend to be forgotten because they're caught in the crossfire and they find themselves in a situation where they don't know what to do with their life, whether they're going back or they're being resettled or not.
I think what you can say about Dadaab is that it has been a protracted emergency for 20 years with very little attention to it, very little funding. And this situation has been something that the local partners here, our education partners and the UNHCR has been struggling to patch for the last 20 years. The last year we had an influx of 160,000 new arrivals, and that's only from January of. So it's not slowing down, it's increasing, and it's putting a very heavy strain on the existing services that we're providing. We see it specifically in education.
In Eastern Africa, more than 12 million people have been affected by the drought, including people in Somalia, of course. And the two southern areas of Somalia, the UN has declared that those two areas was in status of famine.
What is it one can really make a difference in the life of a refugee? When I noticed that there's been refugees who are born in the camp and growing up in the camp, really not knowing the world outside, and there are refugees who are still coming in. So half of their growing experience happened in Somalia and the rest is continuing here. And again, no one knows whether they're going to go back or going to be here.
It is widely accepted that education is a fundamental right and is the main vehicle for the creation of a just, cohesive society. But this very basic right has long been denied to vulnerable, marginalized people around the world, including those caught in the middle of a protracted conflict such as the one that is ravaging Somalia.
We came into contact with the operations of UNHCR and their implementing partners, and we thought as a technical agency, and from a point of view of not only education as a basic right, and also the principle that we have been supporting governments to promote, which is education for all, so that we can promote education from a holistic point of view. So education as a means for livelihood, education as a means for self-fulfillment, and also possibly creating opportunities to make to improving their situation and taking their livelihood into their own hands.
Nearly 500,000 Somalis and other Africans are now in the world's largest refugee camp, Dadaab. They find themselves with very little prospect of reintegration or resettlement. While some education provision has been made inside refugee camps, it has not been made to all school-age children or to youth and adults who require basic education including literacy skills. There is no denial that Dadaab refugees are facing problems such as the access to education. There is a lack of resources, facilities and teachers. Education for girls is inadequate, and so is parental and community commitment. Traditional notion and cultural practices prevented girls and women to exploit potentials of education and skills developments as means for livelihood. Process of teaching and learning is flawed. There is lack of qualified, competent teachers and textbooks in the language of instruction. There are shortfalls in relevant curriculum and culturally responsive learning environment. There are very few teachers who can or are allowed to teach in Somali language and in Somali cultural context. Scope of education is limited to formal school-based education. Literacy and non-formal education for youth and adults is mostly neglected. And those who manage to go to school, after 8 years of basic learning, what comes next? Where do children go for further schooling and knowledge? There is hardly any continuity of education on offer.
When I went to Dadaab last year, I had a chance to observe a literacy class, and it was conducted in a primary school, and it was catering for young generation, well, I would say a youth from the ages of about 18, 19 towards 50, 60, mainly for men, and a very few number of women. But I came across a situation as we left the literacy class, we had an opportunity to observe only 5-10 minutes, and nothing much was going on. They didn't have textbooks, they didn't have a trained teacher, but they were there because they want to do something to improve their livelihood. It's not about where do I go next, it's about living now.
So what we are looking at now is, in the camps we have a population of about 60% children and youth, and that makes for about 250,000. And we have an enrollment of about 60,000. So that's a large number out of school. And also this has to do with access to education, quality of education. It has to do with also future opportunities.
The shortage of teachers is not in terms of training. It is in terms of capacity for the government to pay additional teachers. It's the budget constraint. Considering the fact that education has no boundary, every child has a right to education.
Have any of them been out of camp? Do they dream about the world? Do they imagine the world? How can people live? How can they survive for 20 years being detained in the middle of the desert? What does it do to their psyche, their creativity, their identity, and their self-esteem? How can they stand that insecurity, not knowing whether they would ever be allowed to walk through those gates and enjoy a wide world that begins behind the barbed wire. Imagine you were born in prison, and prison is all you know. You were not sentenced, and you don't know when you would be able to be free, if at all. And what is freedom? Going back to your war-torn country? Being able to move on to the Kenyan capital? Or receiving asylum in some third country? To complicate things further, Kenyan troops entered Somali territory on October 16, 2011.
And my name is Andre Vltchek. I'm a member of a participatory video project facilitated by Filmate International in Dadaab. What we do is we normally write stories that are affecting the refugee community in Dadaab. And the stories can comprise stories that are affecting or impacting the refugee community in the negative ways, or those that are impacting in the positive ways also. And so when you see the kind of production we have made here in the camp, you will find most of the stories are issues that are negatively affecting or impacting the communities. So you will find many families all have lost a lot of hope in the resettlement, and most of them even has experienced stress or trauma in the camp.
What is particularly so bad about the Dadaab camp compared to other refugee camps?
Well, I don't think there is anything so bad about Dadaab compared with other refugee camps. I think if you went to refugee camps almost anywhere, you would find the same kinds of conditions that people are suffering. Camps is always the same. I mean, because I look at the social conditions that people are living under. And I mean, it's appalling. There isn't anything like a good refugee camp.
I think there's a lot education, if understood in a broader sense, can do to facilitate their daily living, and hoping that they might be able to find some kind of hope and expectation, and also opportunities to improve their own livelihoods, no matter how difficult their living context may be.
Education is not only about getting jobs, it's also about how one copes with their social, economic life and political situations. So we are talking about the necessary life skills, the necessary skills, what we call within the field of literacy, and then those skills, how those skills can be used to gain more knowledge, gain more access to information, and that can help my overall life.
We provide the basic services that a government would have provided, but we do not provide much more than that. We're overstretched. We're in an emergency, and we're coping, but you know it's hard.
I think education is very important, and it's the only key factor that can bring solution to this refugee problem.
And then attitude is how everybody treats others and how he treats himself. So once you are educated, then you will not be violent. You will always like things to be peaceful. You will like always to be a negotiator. Whereas that if you are not educated, you don't have knowledge, have no skills, then you can't help others, you can't help yourself, you can't help anybody.
Yeah, to me, I can say, to me, education is the backbone of the life of our lives.
What is ahead for people of Dadaab? What will be the developments in 1 year, and what happens in a decade? Future is uncertain, but what is obvious is that the only sure way forward is through education. It is a slow way. One has to move forward step by step, but obtaining knowledge never fails to bring positive results. Through learning, refugees could acquire life skills. They could boost their own confidence, bargaining power, and ability to speak to the world about their plight. Education and knowledge can also improve their quality of life and the way they interact with each other. If educated and armed with knowledge, once people are free to leave Dadaab, they would be able to start new lives in their native lands or abroad. For now, the future appears to be bleak. World community remembers refugees only during the famine and wars. But in the past and present, international community has deeply impacted development in the Horn of Africa. It should be up to it now to promptly find solutions and to improve the fate of almost 500,000 people whose lives have been until now put on hold indefinitely.